Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining today. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the start. My name is Katherine O'block, and it is a pleasure to be here today to guide you guys through some common gardening challenges that you might experience here on the west coast of Canada. I live and work in East Vancouver as a garden coach, and it's really a pleasure to help demystify the garden and share the benefits of gardening with folks. So we're gonna go over common challenges that you might experience or you may have already been experiencing in your season so far. So just as an overview, today we'll discuss the nature of gardening with nature, go over some basic practices that help promote the health and wellness of your garden, and then in the case of pests and diseases coming up in our gardens, how we can manage those and the integrative pest management method for assessing damage and risk. From there, going over some tips on how to become a sleuth and a detective to figure out of so many possibilities what exactly is going on in the plant and why is it manifesting. And part of that is understanding that there's different causes for plants to show signs of stress, and that can be abiotic or biotic factors, so non-living or living things like beetles and whatnot. So understanding the context in which pests and issues come up in our garden allows us to choose the appropriate method of management. Sometimes we still have large infestations though, and we need to actually manage that infection or infestation. So I will go over a list of least toxic control methods. And then I've just put together a few slides of common insects that might be affecting your garden. But at the end of the lecture today, I would be glad to do a Q&A session, because it's so hard to know what exactly is affecting your garden and what's most relevant. But I'll give a basic overview of some insects, diseases, and disorders that typically affect us here on the West Coast. And then we'll just finish off with a couple gardening resources that can help you into the future. Okay, if there's no questions, then we'll just keep going. So the nature of gardening in nature is that we're in an ecosystem and there must be life and death. And in order for some things to grow, some things must die. And we love having birds, bees, fungi, plants in our garden. They all bring so much joy, life, and vitality to our gardens. But sometimes, you know, in order to get this beautiful butterfly, a caterpillar has to feed on some leaves. And sometimes it's feeding on the leaf of our prized peony, and we want to control it and try to manage that. And yeah, understanding that we are all interconnected in life is helpful when we're considering how we respond and engage with pest management in our gardens. And just as a review of gardening practices that support and enhance the health of your garden overall, first and foremost is the right plant in the right place. It's really important to know what the ideal growing condition is for our plants and to place it as best as we can within our garden so that it can have those ideal conditions. And when the plant is in its ideal condition, it is simply more robust and has a stronger immune system and won't be showing signs of stress and will be less attractive to pests and diseases. In addition to putting it in the right place, we also need to make sure that we're not overfeeding our plants, but not starving them of valuable nutrition, and also watering enough, but not too much. And, you know, once again, it ties back into knowing what the ideal condition is for any particular plant. Tomatoes prefer a nice sunny, dry spot, but would like consistent soil moisture. So yeah, lettuce can certainly tolerate less light and cooler conditions than a tomato, but knowing what they each like will certainly make a difference in the success of your crop and your garden. And then also practicing good seasonal maintenance, knowing when the ideal time is to fertilize, mulch, prune, as well as seed. You know, if we're seeding our beans at the same time as our peas, those beans aren't going to do well because they simply need to be sown later in the year. But knowing our seasonal maintenance and how we're working within the cycle of gardening can certainly go a long way in terms of cultivating a healthy garden. Also, since we're talking about pests and diseases, it is very important to clean our gardening tools regularly. I like to disinfect my digging fork, my shovel, my secateurs, loppers, shears, all of my gardening tools. I wipe them down with a disinfectant after every use. Especially important if we're pruning a plant that has, let's say, a plum tree that's got black knot. It's of critical importance that we sterilize the blade of our secateurs between cuts on that tree to help prevent the spread of infection. But as a general guideline for gardening, it's helpful to clean your gardening tools regularly. It's especially important for me because I'm taking my gardening tools into multiple gardens. If you have the ability to just garden in your own plot, it's still valuable to clean your tools, but perhaps not as essential. And last but certainly not least is keeping a garden journal. So critical for taking note of observations, keeping records from this year to next year, what actually happened, when did we see slug populations increase, if we have chosen to do a treatment for a particular pest, was it effective? These are all great things to write down in a journal. And I like to journal about my garden on pretty much a daily basis, track weather, any wildlife that I've seen, if I've fertilized or watered. Yeah, it's just a very helpful tool, especially if we're trying to figure out what may have caused some damage in my garden. But with those practices in mind and being applied, sometimes we still have damage. And what do you do when your nasturtium is covered in aphids or your tomato is showing signs of early blight? And who is this insect? Is it important? Is it a beneficial insect? You know, how do we piece this puzzle together? And that is where we have integrative pest management. This is a very helpful system of tracking our garden, essentially. It's kind of like the scientific method of having, like, anyway, yeah. So to start with, we've got prevention. Prevention is what we just talked about, all of those good gardening practices, the right plant in the right place, keeping good airflow in the garden, and doing appropriate seasonal care. Also choosing plants that aren't susceptible to disease. But if we do have a nasturtium that's looking sad and we've tried to grow the best garden that we can, we need to correctly identify what exactly all of those black dots along the stem are. And it's important to identify the culprit correctly, because different treatment methods work on certain insects and not others. And we don't want to spray harsh toxic chemicals when we don't need to. So identifying the culprit, monitoring the situation. Is this infestation getting worse? Is it spreading? How is the plant coping? Are there any beneficial insects that I've seen? Are there lady beetles eating at the aphids on the nasturtium? Try to be open and observe really what's going on in the garden. And then what's your action threshold? You know, nasturtiums are chronically affected by aphids. They could be considered a trap crop. Is it acceptable to just pull that nasturtium out and call it a day and put a different plant in there? How much action is required? Or do you really want to keep this nasturtium? It's the only nasturtium you have in your garden. You love it. It brings you so much joy. How can you help manage, and what level of damage is appropriate for your particular situation? And then management options. So if that is your favorite nasturtium, you really want to keep it. It's important to check to see if there's any beneficial insects, because they may be helping you manage the aphids. And if you actually just leave the plant alone, those aphids will go through their life cycle and perhaps be kept in check. If not, you could certainly run your fingers along the stem, crush the aphids. That will reduce some of the beneficial insects if they're present. If they're not present, then there's no harm, and that will certainly help keep your nasturtium alive and vibrant. And then, how effective was your treatment? If you didn't treat your nasturtium and you just let it run its course, how is that going? Have the aphids spread? Is the plant now losing leaves? Or have the aphids simply gone their way? You see some lady beetle nymphs on the foliage. You see this dynamic interplay, and life is running as it should. So the key with managing pests in our garden is really observation and tracking those records. And that's, yeah. So how do we become a better garden detective? What exactly should you be looking for if you're trying to identify your pest or see if the problem is getting worse or better? One thing is characteristic damage. So if you see a big hole in your leaf, do you also see a slime trail leading away from that hole in your leaf? Or do you see little green pellets of excrement that are dropped on the leaf? That will give you clues as to who is actively feeding on your plant. Another question is it active? Is this damage old news, and was it done 2 or 3 weeks ago, or was it done last night and the culprit is actually still around the plant waiting for another opportunity to feed? What has the recent weather been? If we just had a hailstorm and you've got holes in your plants, that might be the cause. In which case there's nothing you can do but support the plant in recovering from that injury. Also taking note of whether new foliage is being affected or the older foliage is. If older foliage has bite marks out of it, and those bite marks have brown edges, and the new foliage at the top is fresh and doesn't have any holes, then the insect or pest may have already passed and that feeding cycle is already complete, in which case action may not be required. So in addition to that, determining whether new foliage is affected or old foliage is really helpful in terms of identifying nutrient deficiencies, because different nutrients are moved more readily throughout the plant's physiology. So these are all just ways of piecing together clues. Any observation you make, any patterning on the leaves, just piece it all together, make notes of all of it, and dive into the research if you don't know it, or maybe through your observations, you'll be like, I know exactly who that is and what we need to do about it. Also, one last note on becoming a better detective, we just need to know the beneficial insects and what their different life forms look like within the garden, because they're helping, you know, aphid midges, they're eating those aphids. They're very tiny. We most likely won't see them if we're not looking for them, but they're beneficials and they're really helping keep the natural balance of the garden in harmony. So that's what we're going to start looking for. And in addition to taking note of any symptoms that you're seeing on the plant, it's helpful to understand that there's abiotic and biotic factors that cause symptoms of stress to manifest in plants. Abiotic causes are non-living causes, such as nutrient deficiency or excess, weather extremes, herbicide drift. So if you were spraying an herbicide on a pathway or someone nearby was, and it was on a windy day, as that herbicide drifts, that can cause damage that looks similar to insects, but aren't. So being mindful of what's going on around your garden. Also, mechanical injury. If you accidentally, or if you're in a community garden and someone accidentally fell over and crushed a plant, that could be what did it, right? It doesn't have to be a fungus or a pest or an insect. Damage happens all the time, sometimes with lawnmowers or weed trimmers, especially important around young trees, that their trunks are protected, because if a weed eater nicks the bark, that makes that tree much more susceptible to biotic factors like fungi or bacteria getting into the trunk and causing rot or decay or other disease problems. So abiotic factors are very real. They can be solved with relative ease if it's a nutrient deficiency excess situation. Weather extremes can be buffered, and we can try to protect our plants from herbicides and other physical damage. But they can certainly lead to ill health. And then we've got the biotic factors, which is often what I think of in terms of garden challenges. I think of pests and diseases like powdery mildew or aphids. I've been contending with squirrels on my balcony garden this year. So there's the living side that affects plants is actually pretty extensive, from the microscopic to large raccoons and others. So yeah, we just want to keep that in mind, and knowing the difference. Abiotic factors are often a bit more uniform in their manifestation, and biotic factors can have more non-uniform symptoms. But we'll just keep that in our mind and can delve deeper as we get into pest management. So it's important to know our beneficials. Who are they and what do they look like? So we've got lady beetles here that are fantastic for keeping aphids in check. They are voracious eaters. They reproduce quickly. Both the adults and the nymphs feed on aphids. And this is the nymph of the lady beetle. So it's interesting. That blew my mind when I first learned that. It looks like an alligator, and it was very surprising to learn that that was indeed a lady beetle, and it was actively helping control the aphids in my garden. So that's good to know. Parasitic wasps, there are many different types and species, and they essentially lay their egg inside the aphid. Their egg then matures and pupates inside the aphid and then emerges. It's a bit gruesome and intense, but it's how nature works, and they're very helpful. So it's nice to have a helping hand with so many aphids. Interestingly, aphids, it's typically females that we see on our plants, and they're called stem mothers. They actually don't need to lay eggs or mate in order to produce offspring, and they'll just produce offspring all season. So it's very helpful to have lady beetles, parasitic wasps, aphid midges, lacewings, everybody feeding on aphids and their eggs. So the aphid midge, once again, a very small insect, but the larvae feed on aphids. Ground beetles are really helpful. They feed on slugs, snails, cutworms, and fly maggots. Tachinid flies lay their eggs on the backs of caterpillars, and then as their eggs hatch, the larvae burrow into the caterpillars and sawflies, and then once again they mature and pupate inside the body of the caterpillar. So, you know, it's helpful to know who in your garden is helpful, and sometimes, you know, yellow jackets can actually be helpful, beneficial insects, even though as humans they can feel scary or imposing or dangerous if you're allergic. But they actually will take whole caterpillars and feed them to their nests of young. So it helps to understand that in the grand scheme of things, everything is beneficial. Like lady beetles need something to feed on. Parasitic wasps need something to lay their egg in. So it's all sustaining a system, but it's a matter of keeping the system in balance and in harmony. Syrphid flies are really lovely. I've actually got a ton of them in my garden just hovering around from sweet alyssum plants. So it's, but they're great. So, and it's an easy way to attract beneficial insects is to plant beautiful flowers like daisies, yarrow, sweet alyssum. Thyme is great. If we are growing cilantro, letting the cilantro go to seed and to flower provides valuable nectar and pollen for a lot of these beneficial insects. It can also be helpful to have a shallow tray of pebbles in the garden that is topped up with water, so the insects can land on the rocks and gently drink the water safely. So, you know, creating another benefit, for those who don't know me, I really love mulch. It is one of my favorite gardening activities, is mulching a garden. And that leaf litter can provide valuable habitat, both for non-beneficial insects and beneficial insects. So it's, yeah, once again, seeking that point of harmony and understanding that some leaves, some plants will die, and ultimately that's okay. It is how the cycle of life works. So now that you've observed your plants, taken note of any symptoms that they're showing, check to see if there's any beneficial insects around, and you've correctly identified the culprit, what is your best treatment method? And that really depends on what you've observed. If you have a severe infestation of 100+ caterpillars, you should probably treat that because that's going to wreak havoc, or just accept that those plants are going to get demolished. If you have 1 or 2 caterpillars that are feeding on some leaves, not a major issue. You can trim the cut bit off, or yeah, just harvest other parts. You know, insect damage and pests can become much more significant and much more of an issue for commercial growers, whereas for home growers, we get the satisfaction of knowing that our garden is alive with life and vitality, and that this slug is eating some lettuce, and that's okay. Yeah, you still have plenty for yourself. Also important in terms of assessing what solutions should be applied is whether the damage is still being done. If it's old damage, there's no point. Look for the next generation, but there's no need to treat now. And then what's your least toxic control method? Typically, that's hand picking insects off, if that's a viable option. It can also be a matter of cutting out the diseased leaves or branches. Yeah, there's a lot of options before we get to products like insecticidal soap, although insecticidal soap can still be helpful. In the next slide, I'll just give a brief overview of commercial products that are available for control. Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacteria that crystallizes inside of caterpillars and kills them. It's very effective, but it only works on caterpillars. So you need to be able to correctly identify caterpillars in order to use that. Horticultural oils are helpful they essentially suffocate eggs of aphids, some moths, sawflies. Yeah, it essentially suffocates or disrupts the physiological process of eggs. And that can be applied in the summer or in the winter. If it's called a summer oil for summer application, and dormant oil for dormant or overwintering applications, and can work quite well. And then you've got insecticidal soap, which is made up of biodegradable fatty acids and act upon contact. So it has to actually hit the insect in order to work. But they work on aphids, earwigs, mealybugs, scale spider mites. Yeah, that can be a helpful product for sure. Silicone dioxide is ground up fossilized diatoms, and it's often sold as diatomaceous earth, and that essentially dries out insects that crawl over it. That works best if it's kept dry. You can use it for ants. Yeah. And then pyrethrins are derived from the pyrethrum daisy, and it's a nerve toxin that can be an effective control if it comes to it. If it's a severe infestation and you really need a form of management, that can be helpful. In terms of powdery mildew or other fungal diseases, sulfur can be really helpful. I'm experimenting with that in my own garden this year. And so far, it's worked pretty well. It prevents the spores of powdery mildew from germinating and other fungi. So I had a very large powdery mildew outbreak, and it has seemed to be a pretty effective control. One note for all of these is that it's always a good idea to test a small portion of the plant before doing a full application of any treatment. And that's largely because you don't know who will tolerate it or not. Sometimes plants have very adverse reactions to these treatments. In the case of the sulfur application in my patio, I accidentally dusted some on a sunflower, and that sunflower now has significant leaf damage. And that's an example of an abiotic cause. A plant that was very healthy, I accidentally got sulfur on, and is now showing signs of stress. For slug control, you can just pick them, but if not, ferric phosphate is a food grade form of iron, and it inhibits the slug's ability to produce slime, so it dries out. But it is a very effective control if you're dealing with a lot of slugs. So these are all commercially available. Often you'll find them under like the Safers brand, or Green Earth are both good companies that offer low toxic pest controls. All right. So now we're on to okay, great. I just noticed that someone chatted in that early morning watering prevents potato blight. Do not water in the evening. So yeah, that is a good practice for sure. Watering earlier in the day allows the sun and wind to dry out the leaves and the plants and the areas around the plants before the cooler nighttime temperatures set in. So thanks for that. Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a brief overview of common gardening challenges that you'll experience potentially. I mean, there are so many possible culprits. It could be insects, it could be disease, or it could be the disorders or abiotic causes. So we're gonna look at insects, diseases, and disorders all in their own right. To get started with insects, though, it is important to understand that there's two different life cycles. One is complete metamorphosis, and the other is incomplete metamorphosis. This helps for not only identification within the garden, but also knowing when a particular insect is going to be a pest. So a swallowtail butterfly is beautiful and very lovely, but at the larval stage, it's also a hungry caterpillar and will surely eat some holes into leaves. But knowing that, once it has finished its 2 to 3 week feeding window, it will move on, and that helps you understand whether the treatment needs to be applied or not. In that case, if it's just one swallowtail larva that's feeding, I would be inclined to just leave it and let it be. As I said, though, if you had 100 plus, you might want to do some management. And then we've got the incomplete metamorphosis, and this applies to like leaf hoppers, things that have essentially very similar to their adult form, and they develop a little bit more like humans. We'll say that. Okay, anyway, we'll move on to the distinction between caterpillars and sawflies. So this is pretty important. If you walk out into your garden and you see someone or something has chewed some ragged holes in your plants, there's a couple things you need to look for. One, the slime trail. If that's a slug, it doesn't apply here. But if you see a green little caterpillar, or worm is often how they're described, on your leaf, it can be helpful to take that insect, and if it's calm enough for you to observe it, great. If not, you can actually put it in your refrigerator for a few minutes, and that will help calm it down. And then you can begin to count the prolegs. So this is the head of this sawfly, and both caterpillars and sawflies have their legs up here, and then they've got at the back end of their body these things called prolegs. And sawflies will have 6 or more pairs of these prolegs, whereas caterpillars will have 5 or fewer pairs. So that's a key distinction that is critical for appropriate identification. And why this matters is, let's say you have a rose and someone's been eating holes and you see that it's got this green worm on here. It could be a caterpillar or it could be a sawfly. Count out the prolegs and you will know what your treatment method will be. If it's a sawfly and it has 6 or more of these prolegs, which does include this like tail end, then BTK, which is typically a pretty effective control for caterpillars, does not apply here. And your best treatment is actually just to wash it off with some water, and they'll go to the ground and won't be a major issue for your rose, and they'll continue in their life cycle. Whereas if it has 5 or fewer of these prolegs, then you've got a caterpillar. And in that case, BTK, that bacterial spray, will actually be quite effective and keep the caterpillar population in check. But that's one example of really needing to appropriately identify what the culprit is. Here we've got the imported cabbage worm. If you've ever grown kale, you might have seen it. This is a very common pest. The caterpillars chew holes in the leaves. They can cause significant damage on small plants, or when they feed in the broccoli or cauliflower floret. Other than that, if they're attacking a mature kale plant or collard plant, you know, typically you just have some holes that are chewed out of leaves, but it's not significant, and the plant can certainly withstand the bit of nibbling by these guys. And they do have multiple generations, so you'll actually see the butterfly and these little cabbage worms throughout the entire growing season here, pretty much. Yeah, and you can, if you want to, pinch off those caterpillars, and if you've got chickens, feed them to the chickens. They always appreciate them, or dispose of them how you wish. But that's a pretty common insect here. Then we've got cutworms, and this is always sad when you walk into your garden. Your seedlings have been coming up, you're like so excited, and then you see that your seedling has fallen off at the soil level. That's a bummer. And it could be two things. One, it could be damping off, which is a fungus. But as this picture here shows, this was actually just chewed right off. This fat little caterpillar here had a wonderful meal last night, and now you no longer have a seedling living. So they're always disappointing. And when you notice that in your garden, if you noticed it within a couple of days, root around the base of your plants and try to see if you can find any of those cutworms, and once again, dispose of them how you wish. There are also climbing cutworms, and they'll actually climb up onto the leaves and feed at night. And once again, they eat large ragged holes in the leaves. And to manage those guys, yeah, hand picking works well. Unfortunately for cutworms, even though they are caterpillars, they are not very susceptible to BTK. So what is typically a very good low toxic treatment for caterpillars doesn't work as well for cutworms, so best to pick them off. And I don't know if any of you have seen these pupa in the soil, but that is the pupa of a cutworm. So if you find those mahogany bullets, you can just get rid of those right away, and you'll be happy you did. All right, and then we've got leaf miners, which are just kind of fascinating. They feed between the upper and lower surface of the leaf, inside the leaf. And what's kind of neat about them, if you're trying to discern whether the damage is fresh or old, if you actually cut off a leaf that's been infected and hold it up to the sun or light, you'll actually be able to see maggots actually actively feeding inside of the leaf. And in that case, you know, you can just go through and clean off any leaves and dispose of them. And that is a pretty effective control if it's not a large infestation or if it doesn't happen annually. If this is a bit of a perennial issue for you, you can actually lay out floating row covers, and that will help prevent the adults from being able to lay their eggs on the leaf. So these little cylinders, white cylinders that are laid out next to each other in very straight rows, those are the eggs. And once they hatch, maggots will actually burrow into the leaf and start feeding, and then they come out. And they affect members of the Chenopodiaceae family, which is your beets, spinach, chard, lamb's quarter, quinoa. It will affect dock as well, and sorrel. Yeah, so it's an interesting insect. If it's a small infestation, it won't wreak too much havoc. And then we've got sucking aphids. So sucking insects. These insects all feed off the sap of your plants. Aphids, a telltale sign of aphid damage is like a curled, distorted leaf or tip on a plant. And if you kind of open up the leaves, if you see black or green bugs going up and down the stems, you've got some aphids. But you may also have beneficial predators mixed in there, so keep that in mind. Sooty mold can also develop as a result of aphids. As the aphids are sucking out the plant sap, a honeydew drops on the lower leaves, and that honeydew gets colonized by sooty mold, which is a mold that has a black sooty appearance. It's not really a major issue, but it is often what lets someone know that maybe their rhododendron or their pieris has aphids or scale that are sucking on the sap. So I can't think of a time when I've seen sooty mold on a vegetable crop with aphids, though. I often think of sooty mold and aphids being more associated with ornamental plants. And most aphids feed on specific plants or plant groups, so you don't have to worry that if your nasturtium has aphids, that those aphids will transfer to your rose, because likely they won't. They are more specialized feeders than that. One way to help prevent aphids from getting established in your garden is to water well, not too much, but when our plants are stressed by drought, the tensegrity of their cells gets weakened, and it's much easier for aphids to penetrate into the plant cell and begin sucking. Over-fertilizing with nitrogen fertilizers can also lead to a very rapid growth, and that growth is often more susceptible to aphids because, once again, the tissues are just compromised. They don't have that proper tension or rigidity that a healthy plant would have. So yeah, don't over fertilize it. Keep your garden well watered, and if you plant a lot of insectary flowers and plants, you should have a lot of natural predators that are ready to help combat those aphids. Spider mites aren't super common in the garden, but they are a very unique insect, and if you grow any house plants, you may have encountered spider mites. They thrive in hot, dry conditions, and they'll spin this fine web, and then you'll just see these clusters of tiny little spider mites, and they are feeding on the sap of your plant, and they'll create this yellow stippling effect on the leaf. And in severe infestations, the leaf tips start to brown, and eventually you could even lose some leaves. But getting more humidity to plants suffering with spider mites can really help. And if you're not attached to the plant, you could just toss the plant. Thrips are a tiny insect, often just causing cosmetic damage. But they also like scrape out and suck out the contents of plant cells, and as they hollow out the contents, it creates this silvery whitish streak between the leaf veins, and thrips unfortunately cause damage both by their feeding on the leaves and then when the adult lays eggs in the leaves and in flower buds. So they'll start to feed, and then you've got holes that were small in the case of like a flower bud. As the thrips are feeding, when the flower opens, you've got a big hole because the thrip was feeding in there. Yeah. But all in all, they're not usually a huge nuisance in the garden. But something good to know about. And then these next insects are ones that feed on the roots. But in the case of the cabbage flea beetle, the larvae feed on the roots, causing serious damage, often to like younger plants, seedlings. But then as they mature, the flea beetles will eat a bunch of tiny holes in leaves. So they cause damage on two ends of the plant. Yeah, and they'll feed on cabbage, spinach, lettuce, other plants. With some of these insects, if you plant later in the spring, you avoid the first round of adults that emerge early in the spring from overwintering. So it gives you a little bit of a head start. You get or maybe not a head start, but at least you won't be contending with very hungry beetles right at the get-go. Yeah, but pyrethrins can work if you've got a serious infestation. Crop rotation is really helpful in terms of managing all of these things. Crop rotation and interplanting with companion plants and insectary plants is very helpful for keeping all of these things in check so they don't become huge issues. Wireworms are super common. If you have ever turned a lawn into a vegetable garden, you will most likely have seen some wireworms. Their larvae are these, classic little yellowish, kind of hard larvae. Yeah, and they bore themselves into tubers, corms, large seeds like peas and beans, and they'll even actually burrow into the crown of lettuces and other plants. Wireworms, yeah, when they cause that damage by tunneling in, they open the doorway for a lot of other diseases and pathogens to also affect the plant. So it is good to keep them in check. They are pretty easy to manage. In the heat of the summer, they go further down into the soil, so their feeding isn't quite as active. And in the spring and the fall, when the temperatures cool a bit, they are feeding more actively at the surface. And during those times, you can take a potato, cut a section off, and then stick a skewer through it and bury it in the garden about 6 inches deep. And you can do those throughout the garden. And then just come by periodically, lift them out, and you should actually see wireworms in there. And then you can dispose of them, kill them, or feed them to some birds. So yeah, wireworms, although they can be a nuisance and definitely wreak havoc, they're certainly not the most difficult pest to control for. Yeah. Carrot rust fly, yeah, can really ruin your carrots. It's sad, especially when you've been like eagerly watching them grow, develop. The top of the carrot looks good, and you pull it up, and a little larva has fed on the root. It's tunneled its way through. Yeah, and then once again, it just opens it up to other pathogens to come in and rot to take over. Floating row covers can be helpful with the management of this. So putting a row cover out at the time of seeding. Row covers are nice because you can they let airflow and water through, but they keep out the tiny little flies from laying their eggs. And that can be an effective control. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's about it for those guys. And then we're into disease management. And this comes down to a triangle of the pathogen, environment, and susceptible host. All three of these factors need to be present in order for a disease to manifest. If we take the pathogen out, or if we change the environmental conditions, or if we remove a susceptible host, we won't have disease manifesting in the garden. So let's just dive into the diseases. All right, so powdery mildew is brutal. Gosh, powdery mildew is really, so it's not the worst. It won't kill a plant necessarily unless it happens really early in the season. If the infection is really bad, it can reduce yields because you're cutting off the leaves and therefore reducing the plant's ability to feed itself. Yeah, the best prevention is really choosing resistant cultivars and managing the symptoms promptly. As soon as you see the classic white powdery spots develop on a leaf, take those leaves off. And this year I'm experimenting with sulfur. I've used water in the past with moderate success. It's tricky to overcome powdery mildew. Often, though, it comes at the end of the season and it won't be too detrimental to your crops. And managing, like cutting out the infected parts and spraying it with water during the mid of the day to prevent spores from germinating, or applying with a sulfur based product can help mitigate the spread of the disease. Late blight comes with growing tomatoes in Vancouver, I think. Hopefully not. And certainly by keeping a clean garden and removing any infected plant material as quickly as possible will be key in reducing the potential spread of the disease. This fungus is interesting because it does actually require the leaf to be wet in order for it to infect the plant. And that's often why blight happens in falls that are very wet, or wet summers. You know, blight can actually take place at any time in the season. It doesn't have to be late in the season. It's really whenever we've got a cold, wet season, and tomatoes don't love those conditions at the best of times. And if we already have spores in the soil, unfortunately, it leads to a very quick demise of the tomato plant. Yeah, not much more to say on that one. If you have questions, please feel free to chat them in. Damping off, I alluded to this earlier. When you come out to your garden, your seedlings have germinated and then they've promptly fallen off at the soil level. Fungi that prevent seeds from germinating, and this essentially like a water-soaked lesion in the stem causes collapse. And it happens when the soils are cool and wet. If you get this and you've been starting your seeds indoors and a flat gets it, it can spread pretty rapidly through that entire flat. So it's hard to control in that regard. Using sterile starting mix is helpful. Allowing for good airflow and drainage is of critical importance in our gardens, always. And also, yeah, seeding when it's appropriate, when the soil temperature is actually warm enough for that to initiate the growth of that plant quickly and healthfully. Damping off, yeah, sometimes it happens in the garden, but its greatest impact can certainly be felt in indoor seed starts. And then we've got disorders. So these are the abiotic factors affecting plants. So nutrient excess or deficiency can lead to some significant symptoms on leaves and fruit. Weather conditions certainly can have their impacts. It's important to know when we don't have a problem. So knowing patterns or specific characteristics of a plant, if this is a golden thyme, its leaves may look a bit chlorotic, but that's actually just that variety of thyme. It has golden leaves. For zucchinis, sometimes they have that pretty white silvery patterning on the top of their leaves, which can look very similar to powdery mildew, but in that case it's not. Some rhododendrons or plants have fur on, or these hairs on the back of their leaves, and those are it's totally natural. The plant's not unhealthy, but it is important to know that those aren't signs of ill health or stressors. And then disorders can lead to pollination problems. So abortion of fruit, loss of flowers due to a frost, or sometimes the biotic birds will come and affect fertility of our flowers by eating them. So just to give a little bit more detail on nutrient deficiencies, nitrogen deficiency is typically nice dark green veins with yellowing on the leaf between the veins. And this can be easily remedied. Whenever you suspect a nutrient deficiency, it's a good idea to get a soil test. And you can just get a test for pH. That typically runs about $20. But once you know the pH of your soil, you can actually look at a soil nutrient availability chart and begin to see what nutrients become more or less available at a certain pH level, and begin to remedy the situation that way. But being informed of how you're engaging with the biochemistry of the soil is very important. And then we've got blossom end rot on tomatoes, which unfortunately is a pretty classic issue. And that can come from calcium not being readily available for the plant to take up. And it can also be caused by inconsistent watering or drought stress of tomatoes, followed by a solid watering. Or even, once again, too much nitrogen, leading to too much of a rapid vegetative growth. And the plant, even though calcium may be available, isn't able to take it up at the rate that the fruit is growing due to the over-fertilization. And then knowing how nutrients move within the plant. If the older leaves are showing symptoms of a nutrient deficiency, it's an indication, well, those are often nutrients that are mobile. So the plant can take those nutrients from the plant leaves that were already established and have grown well, and then redirect them to the fresh growth so that the fresh growth is healthy. If you're seeing the damage on the younger leaves and the old leaves look healthy and well, then those are nutrients that the plant is not able to move easily through its system. So those are stuck in those older leaves and they can't be brought up to help the younger leaves. And this little diagram shows the different nutrients, but there's certainly good information on that that you can delve into if you would like to get more into that. And then some helpful resources. One that I find critically helpful is the West Coast Gardening Natural Insect, Weed, and Disease Control by Linda Gilkison. She lives here on the West Coast and is a master gardener and just has a lot of experience and specialty with insects and diseases. Her book, Backyard Bounty, is also a great resource. I also like What's Wrong with My Plant. It's helpful to have photos and diagnostic keys to help guide us through the process of identifying what could be causing these problems, because a lot of these challenges can have similar symptoms. And it really requires getting to know the different culprits, I guess you could say. And then the Master Gardeners Association of BC hosts clinics usually. We're not hosting any clinics this year or right now due to COVID, but they may open up in the fall. And in that case, please bring questions to any Master Gardener clinic. We're always glad to help field questions and try and figure out what's going on with your plant. You can also email the Master Gardeners Association with any plant questions, and a Master Gardener will get back to you. So I think that's everything for me today. I've gone a bit over on time, but I'm open to any questions that folks may have.
So I think, this is Shireen. I think Nina's going to unmute everyone. So any questions, feel free to ask. I have one question. Your presentation was awesome, by the way. So much information. Thank you. So this is the first year I'm having a balcony garden, and I bought a bunch of plants from the nursery. Do you feel like they're more susceptible to like pests or diseases? Because I got a lot of aphids this year.
Yeah. You know, having worked in the nursery industry for a number of years, yes, some plants could definitely be more stressed. Yeah. It can be hard to keep those 6-packs well watered. Even within a flat, you may be watering well, but one cell within that flat is staying dry, and that's just more susceptible to aphids and attack. Yeah. But our home seedlings can also be stressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought it was kind of, I thought it was unique because it's like nothing else is around on my balcony. And there was 2 plants in particular that had just tons of aphids on it. And unfortunately, I had to get rid of them.
Okay. Yeah. What were they?
Funny enough, like things that say that that aphids don't like, dill, and the other one that I had to get rid of. What was the other one? I want to say thyme.
Oh,
yeah.
Funny. I never would have guessed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. You know, I bet on that dill plant, you probably had some beneficial insects.
Oh, great.
But
I did observe them for a while, and then I did squish them with my fingers, but it was like an infestation. It was bad, so I just decided, it was time to compost them.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing about the garden. You just compost them, and it's okay. Like you can put a new plant in there, and on a balcony garden, it's hard to be able to leave a sick plant there. I mean, space is of the essence, so you really want to try to get the most out of it. And if your plant is suffering, it's most likely going to keep suffering. Yeah. It's hard to bring them back, especially annual crops. If it was a perennial, that's a different story. Yeah.
Question from Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Thanks, Catherine. Do you think rats would eat kale and chives from a roof garden, raised bed on a roof garden? It's the first time it's ever happened.
Yep. No, I think they could. Yep.
So they are vegetarian.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, no, they'll wreak havoc on tomatoes.
Oh.
Yep. Yeah. My theory is that they really appreciate our fresh garden produce because it's a little bit better than the other food they scavenge.
Yeah, they have babies to feed too, I guess, at this time.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good luck.
Oh,
It
thank you.
gets tricky with rats and larger rodents.
Yeah.
But sometimes just draping some netting over the box can be helpful if they're in small containers. But yeah,
And that's that row netting you were discussing earlier, the, forget what you called it.
well, I guess you could actually do some floating row cover.
Oh,
I guess I was thinking something along the lines of chicken wire, like a smaller grade chicken wire.
Yeah.
That they wouldn't be able to sneak through, and
That's right.
would protect your plants and allow your plants to get airflow and water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give it a try.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't think so. Well, that was a lot of information. I appreciate you all sticking in there with me. If you have any questions that come up in your garden, feel free to let me know. I'd be glad to help troubleshoot any areas. And I think the biggest takeaway is to really know at what level do you need to take action, and what are you willing to accept for all life to thrive in the garden. Yeah. And one other thing is keep your eye out for Japanese beetles. I should have put a slide in about the Japanese beetle, but that's a new pest that will, if you ever see a Japanese beetle, definitely kill it without doubt. That's a horrible thing to say, but that's kind of how I feel. They're a flying beetle. Their larvae feed on the roots of grasses and other plants, and then just about this time of year, they start to fly, and the adults will skeletonize leaves of roses, so many different types of plants. It's a serious pest, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has been putting up a lot of advertisements around Vancouver around the Japanese beetle, just to raise awareness, because we're trying to control that pest. So, yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. We appreciate you.
Okay, yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Shireen.